Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to the McMichael Symposium for Painting Canada, Tom Thomson and the Group of Seven. Le Canada en peinture, Tom Thomson et le Groupe de Sept, c'est le Symposium aujourd'hui. I'm Victoria Dickinson. I'm the Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director of the museum, and it's my privilege and an honor to welcome you all here today. We are so excited about the exhibition, Painting Canada, and you'll have a chance to see it if you haven't seen it already. But it's wonderful as well to be able to invite here speakers from Canada and Europe who've joined us to talk about Tom Thomson and Painting Canada and the Group of Seven. So this is going to be a great day, and it's a wonderful opportunity to start thinking about our own art, the art that's produced in this country, thinking about it from many points of view, and you're going to hear a lot of perspectives on the Group of Seven and on Canadian art today. First of all, I'd like, however, to welcome the representative of our symposium and exhibition patron, the A.K. Prakash Foundation, Dr. Michael Weinberg, to say a few words on behalf of the foundation.
Good morning, esteemed faculty, Victoria and Katerina, ladies and gentlemen. As a trustee of the A.K. Prakash Foundation, it's a pleasure to welcome you and to be able to sponsor this significant and wonderful event. The A.K. Prakash Foundation is a new foundation. It has a dual mandate. On one hand, medicine, on one hand, art. In art, we're here to promote historical Canadian art, and on the medical side, we're looking to educate physicians from underprivileged countries. What we're looking for in our foundation is to have a ripple effect. So we're looking not only to fund one event, but to continue to fund other events and to fund events like this where people will take things away with them, and that'll encourage more learning and more investment in historical Canadian art. On the medical side, in July of 2013, we have an awesome reconstructive plastic surgeon coming from Zimbabwe. She's an MD, PhD, fluent in Shona, English, and Japanese, because she did her PhD in Japan. She'll go back and do burn care, cleft lip care, and teach at the university there. In July or August, we're also having a physician coming from Addis Ababa. She's probably a general surgeon doing pediatric general surgery. We have an alliance through University of Toronto with Ethiopia, the university in Addis Ababa. Ethiopia has 90 million people, of which 60% roughly are under the age of 16. They have 3 surgeons there. So by us adding a pediatric general surgeon and sending young surgeons from here to train with that surgeon when they're up and running, increases their capacity by 25%. We hope to get a neurosurgeon, and we also hope to get another pediatric plastic surgeon. So that'll be a magnificent and significant change to their capacity in that country. On the art side, I guess we're here for the arts. I guess got carried away with the medicine part. Painting Canada and this symposium are only the first of 2 of many to follow sponsorships from this foundation. If anybody knows Ash Prakash, he's a very passionate person, specifically passionate about Canadian art, specifically passionate about improving medicine in underprivileged countries. So we take this opportunity to share our commitment with you, to invite you to, we invite and challenge you, I should say, to come along with us. It's an open foundation, so if you want to join us for this wonderful ride, we'd love to have you along, and we're going to be out there doing it, not just talking about it. I hope you have a wonderful and excellent day.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks again to the A.K. Prakash Foundation. This is so exciting for us to have this kind of support to look at Canadian art.
I'm Joyce Siemens. I'm an art historian, and I teach at York. Oh, great. That's even better. And then you have yours.
Thank you.
I don't have to do much talking. Is this working? Yeah. Do
we have to turn it on?
Thank you, Anne.
It is on. Yeah.
Thank you. We have 3 panelists today who will be engaged in a discussion. Each of them is a curator of this exhibition, and I am particularly looking forward to hearing what they have to say. I haven't seen the exhibition yet, but I'm quite familiar with its contents, and I have had the opportunity to have a look at the catalog, and I am really, really looking forward to seeing the show. So I would like first to introduce Katerina Atanassova. Sorry, I had it right, and I do it wrong every time. Okay. Katerina is the chief curator here, and she is the person who has been most deeply engaged with the exhibition through the McMichael connection. She has studied in Eastern Europe, and she has studied at the University of Toronto in the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, a great preparation for coming to the group of 7. But as you will see, her major initial work in Canadian art history was at the Varley Gallery, where she did a remarkable job in drawing the attention of the public to the work of Varley, but to the group of 7. Sorry. Thank you for making that point. It often happens to me. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Okay, I'll talk right into the mic. So we're very pleased to have Katerina here. Each of our panelists has had a deep exposure to Canadian art history. Anna Hudson, in the middle, is a colleague whom I have worked with over a number of years. Her background is in Canadian art history as well. She was the Associate Curator of Canadian Art at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and in that capacity she and I work closely together. She has worked on a variety of exhibitions related to the group at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and she has been part of this curatorial team. I would also like to introduce Ian Dejardin, who is a Scot with a French-sounding origin name of French origin, but Scotified, and who has, at the Dulwich Gallery in London, been very much responsible for making this exhibition a reality. And I have to say that my questions of our panelists is to try and examine how the exhibition came to be, why this exhibition now, and what the particular characteristics of this exhibition are, particularly in the context of the fact that the show is here now, but was shown in several European venues. And I hope Marietta, whom I haven't met yet. Marietta, can you raise your hand? Hi, Marietta. I'm going to call on you in a few minutes just to ask one question that I'm going to ask of all the panelists about the exhibitions, but I'd like to know more about the Groninger experience. So my interest is in examining what is unique about this exhibition, why this exhibition now, the particular relationship of this work, and I'm going to come back to this later within the context of the 1924 exhibition, which you speak of in the catalog and which obviously influenced you, and with respect to an exhibition that some of you may have seen at the National Gallery called Terre Sauvage, which was a turn of the century, 1999 to 2001 exhibition that also traveled to Mexico City, to 4 venues in China, and to Lillehammer in Norway, so another Norwegian venue, to Sweden and to Copenhagen. So my question is, when you were, again, this is a contextual question, when you were creating this exhibition, how much were you influenced by the experience of those other exhibitions, their reception in Europe? But let's hold that thought, and that's the larger context. My first question, and I have to find my first question, is, just one second, on the curatorial premises of this show, Ian, what was the impact on the development of this exhibition of the British eye. So this comes back to this context. What is different about this show when we look at it from your perspective, and when you were involved in the selection of the work, deeply involved?
Yeah. Now let's just check. Can you all hear me, or do I have to lean forward? I'll do better. Can I take it out? There you go. I'm too tall. There's no getting away from it. In putting together the show, can you just repeat the question for me, because I want to get it right?
Of your perspective, the British perspective, or perhaps the Scottish perspective.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, having asked you to repeat it, I then interrupt you. The British perspective, in a funny kind of way, I'm not the right person to answer that question, because obviously Canadians will see it perhaps differently, and you might see in the exhibition, you might see things that you didn't expect to see, and I think that would be the indicator of the British eye. But I know that I came to the show, and I don't want to impinge on your first bigger question, but through simply being a great fan of the art, a real enthusiast for Painting Canada. Whether for the Painting Canada, but if there was any influence on the choice and the selection, I think the British eye would be influenced by the fact that actually between 1912 and 1932, which is roughly the areas that we're talking about, in England there is a great love of landscape, yes, but there is very little, I think, in terms of the post-impressionist influence on landscape. We have, say, Roger Fry and Vanessa Bell, both of them quite bad artists. Sorry, I just dismissed Bloomsbury in one sentence. There you go. I hate them both. And there really is, I'm not a dogmatic person at all, I'm sorry I did. There really is nothing there. There is nothing there that compares with the richness of the landscape tradition here in Canada in those particular dates. So funnily enough, there's a gap in England. Now, in England, the English love landscape, yes. But of course we tend to go back to Turner, Constable, the golden age of British watercolour around the beginning of the 19th century. So I think our love of landscape doesn't take off again until Paul Nash, who comes in a bit later, and then you have the surrealist influence. And so there's a gap. Now, as a Scot, you'll notice I'm very careful with my Englishes and my Scottishes. As a Scot, on the other hand, we have the Scottish colourists. And when you look at them, Cadell, people like that, they are very much post-impressionist. They have this bright colour, the extraordinary painterliness of their work, and there's a definite chime with Canadian art. So I think, just to try and pull all this together to actually answer your question, there is, I think, an element of the British eye seeing things in Canadian art that are sort of familiar, but this huge gap in the English vision of landscape in that period means that for a British audience, and I put together exhibitions I've done it for 25 years, I knew that a British audience would fall in love with this work. Well, I didn't know it, but I would have disowned them if they hadn't.
Katerina, Katerina, how does the show that we will see downstairs in a few minutes differ from the show that was in London?
Well, I think, welcome everyone. I think the interesting challenge for all of us, and I speak for Mariette as well, is how we as curators saw that selection of works and how we approach the hanging or the interpretation of all the works of art in a different narrative for each and different institution. And I had that an interesting challenge for myself as we were bringing the show back in Canada. It's our patrimony, it's our familiarity with the works, and also our critical eye as to how we hang yet another show of the Group of Seven, and here at McMichael, where we actually have so many of those. So I was very mindful of all those challenges, and I greatly appreciated what Ian and his staff did in Dulwich, and I also visited Marietta in Groningen in the early September. And I must say each and every curator interpreted the show differently and in a wonderful way. And every time I went and saw the exact same works, it was different. But for McMichael, I had to answer different questions. So it was important to, without being chronological, without being even thematic, without following the same logic, philosophy, and expectation that we have in Canada for 5-6 decades towards Tom Thomson, the Group of Seven, to create an exciting, different, fresh look on the works and on the artists. So what you will see down is a little enhanced and differently interpreted hanging with the inclusion of a lot of archival material, with a lot of material objects that belong to the artist. The voices of the artists, quotes from their correspondences, their writings, their interviews, their poetry writings that enhance the voice of the artist and the feel for the nature, for the site where they worked. And 9 new loans, which my co-curators graciously agreed that I would need to expand, because I'd like to retain the British approach, if I may say, or Scottish-British approach, I should say. So the first room Ian approached as being entirely Tom Thomson, and the last room was Lauren Harris. And in order for me to follow that with different, architecturally different spaces, is I pulled the last 1917 Thomsons, and I almost created a memorial wall of the last Thomson spring for us in a different space. So in Gallery 1 is only 1915, 1916 major works and canvas and sketch together. And in the last room of Harris, I needed more Arctic canvases and sketches by Harris in order to bring that very forceful and very powerful conclusion, almost a shrine look like experience and sensation of where Harris went. I think it would be for us, or for me, to put early Lake Superior sketches and canvases next to the Arctic a little bit too risky. So I had to go a little bit in terms of chronology to present Harris in a better light. But I hope that answers. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say, of course, one of the great differences, just to elaborate on what I was saying earlier, of a Brit organising a show on Canadian art is that for my audience, there's no baggage at all. From the point of view of putting on an exhibition, this is a good thing. No baggage is good. It means you have to really boil it down to tell the story. And so you can imagine for Katerina the questions about, you know, what do the artists say, to hear their voice. At Dulwich, the first question is not what is the artist's voice, it's who is the artist. It was as simple as that. Not a single one of the artists in this show was known to a British audience at all. And so my task was very, very different. I had to introduce artists in a way that made them stick in the memory, but didn't involve chronology. Nobody in England was going to care who came first, you know, whether MacDonald had been ahead of the game in 1909 or whatever, because they didn't know who we were talking about. So in many ways, my presentation had to be quite simple. And if there was a hidden agenda there, it was the introduction of Tom Thomson, really putting him forward because he was such an astonishing genius, and I think that would work on global terms. But also I had to do it as a very simple journey, and so I interpreted the journey as a journey between Tom Thomson and Lauren Harris. It's a kind of spiritual but also geographical journey, because that's the other thing. In England, a casual reference to Algoma is going to get you nowhere. I needed maps. So it's a very different challenge.
That's very evident in the catalogue as well, yes.
How much, Ian, did you worry about your audience saying, oh, I've seen that before, or is that derivative of a British artist that they already knew? Was that something you worried about?
No, I didn't. I don't think there was any concern about a British audience coming to it. It's kind of what I said earlier, in the sense that there's really nothing in Britain to really compare. A very educated audience would mentally, I'm sure, be ringing chimes with Augustus John and Dixon Innes and Derwent Lees, but then they were painting around 1911 in Wales, and the results of their work is very, very similar in many ways to what Tom Thomson was doing at the same time. But actually, Augustus John is wildly out of fashion in England at the moment. People aren't really aware of his work. They're far more interested in Gwen, his sister. He's deeply unfashionable. So I don't think people were picking up on that at all. And funnily enough, the frame of reference, I think, for the group of 7 was actually more European, and so Marietta will be filling us in on that. But on the broadest possible way, if you were being utterly simplistic and talking in sound bites, which of course I never do, except to the press. Talking to the press, you would say, Tom Thomson is Canada's Van Gogh, and you'd kind of blush as you did it. But nonetheless, that was probably the reference to the post-impressionists that people wanted to hear. When you've got a poster like Tom Thomson's The Jack Pine, it sort of says it all. It's the best poster I've ever produced at Dulwich Picture Gallery.
Katerina, you wanted to add something.
Well, I think Ian brought that issue because I would like to hear Marietta's comment, because her interpretation of the show was quite significantly different. But what I was impressed is to see how she curated a complementary side of her own artist, the Plug group, and how the links worked really in an amazing way visually.
Well, that's very interesting, because I wanted to, we'll go to Marietta now, if you're comfortable coming up here. Because my next question, I had one in between, which I'll come back to, was that when the 1999 show was installed in Mexico, there was a Mexican nationalist show that was installed at the same time, and it really enhanced the audiences who knew nothing about Canadian art, as yours did not, their understanding of the difference between, the folk narrative and the dramatic nationalist school, the stylistic similarities in some respects and differences in others. And so I wondered whether or not you, and I think, or the Norwegian exhibition had looked to create a context within the your own artistic environment and your collection or borrowed works when you installed the exhibition. So could you tell us a little bit about how you presented the show and what the response was?
Let me first say that...
you've got one.
Yeah, I would like to sit there as well, but perhaps you can... Okay. Let me first tell you that I was interested in the group of 7 for about 10 years. That was where my idea started to bring this group of very important painters also to the Netherlands. And in fact, it was a Canadian idea because 10 years ago I have a friend in Canada, in Toronto, and I'm curating in the Netherlands, in Groninger Museum. And at that time I was writing an article on one of the Ploeg, an artist group in Groningen, a catalogue text, and I sent it to him. And he was reading it, and then he responded to me, well, that is very interesting. It reminds me of the group of 7. Have you ever heard about it? And that was where it all started. So there was, for me, a kind of direct link between an artist group in Holland and an artist group in Canada I never heard of. And I was an art historian. How come? So that was where the idea started. And so it was almost a quest to bring this exhibition to Groningen, but we succeed. And it didn't stay a view from afar, but it was really interesting to compare this unknown, beautiful landscape art with our own collection of landscape painting from the Ploeg from the same period. So that was what Katerina is referring about. That was quite interesting to see, and also the visitors in the Groninger Museum were very excited to see this combination. So it was very good.
And can you tell us? Can you all hear in the back? We're okay? Okay. Can you tell us what your observations were? You've written in the catalogue a little bit about what the De Ploeg was and what they were looking at. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what the outcome was in your own mind as a curator looking at these works?
What the outcome was?
How you saw the group of 7. I mean, you brought them to see what the comparison was.
Well,
so
yes.
What was your impression?
Yeah, well, my first impression, because we were not familiar with this group, so it's in a way it's good that you're not familiar because you have not all that baggage, because in Canada the group of 7 is over familiar, so you can look with I hope with fresh eyes. So I saw kind of similarity, especially in color and in, well, sometimes also technique with the expressionists in Holland and in Germany, and especially because the Ploeg artists were, I will tell you later this afternoon, inspired by the expressionism. So I think what I see when I look at the group of 7 is that, of course, I know nature was their biggest teacher, and it was a very interesting culture, but of course there was also the zeitgeist at that period. And one way or another, men artists are influenced, whether they say they are or they're not. And I think that is very interesting to see. And of course, many paintings are more late Impressionist, but there are traces of Expressionism, in my opinion, in color, in technique as well. And I will later on point that out, because that is of a special interest to me as a curator of Expressionism, of course. So,
may I ask you one more question in terms of that contextualization of the group and the comparison with the Dutch groups? Did you look at all at the relationship between Mondrian and Harris in terms of an evolution?
There are many different views to look upon this art. Of course, Mondrian and Theosophy is very interesting. And Harris, being in Berlin from 94 till 98, is a very interesting period, of course, and I don't know if there's going on a lot of research in Canada about this period, but in that period there was also Kandinsky on the verge of writing his famous book, and his impact of Kandinsky, of Theosophy, on many painters, of course. So I think there's much more to research, to do a lot of research, especially also on Harris, who is a great painter. So, yeah.
Can I?
Yeah.
No, I was I the only one who saw it in Oslo? I think I was, yes. This was interesting in Oslo as well, because the curator there brought in some works from the Scandinavian tradition, which of course is very strong and important in this case, because of course Harris and MacDonald visited the Scandinavian show in Buffalo in 1913, and so were actually definitely influenced. And to see works by Fjeisted and Fjeisted, probably pronunciation, yeah, Fjeisted, and Harold Solberg within the show, or not quite hanging alongside, and and Munch as well, Munch's landscapes, Nikolai Astrup, people like that. There was a definite chiming there. They hung very nicely together, and the influence, of course, in this case was very strongly documented. But I wonder, in fact, and I'm not sure what Marietta thinks about this, but there is a kind of very broad sort of northern tradition, as it were, of the way in which the lessons of Expressionism and Post-Impressionism spread across the world. It seems to have spread up, north, as it were, in a particular way. And I think probably, if you look in Russia, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, and all points north, you find something similar happening almost around the world at this time. So the Canadians are not, as I think they have been posited in the past, they're not a kind of Canada-specific happening. There's something happening globally, and the Canadians fit in rather well with all of that, which is interesting. So I think you think of it as a national thing, but maybe it's international.
And that's one of the questions, but it's interesting. Marietta, I won't keep you standing here, but I have one more quick question for you. I mean, in fact, what Ian is speaking about is the Canadians were responding to the Dutch and Anton Mauve and the whole issue of, what was our national school. Yeah. So stylistically, you have post-impressionism, expressionism, and the move towards abstraction. But in fact, again, from a context perspective, the best thing you could really show in terms of how Canadian art evolved, or what it responded to, was the popularity of Dutch artists.
Of Hague School. That's another very interesting field to explore, I think. There was a tradition of Hague School collecting in especially Montreal. And one of the curators of the National Gallery, Charlie Hill, he lectured twice in Groningen, and he pointed out some of the paintings that were collected in Canada. And it's very interesting to know that one of these paintings, which is now on show in Groningen, was actually a painting from Matthijs Maris in Canada, and now in the collection of the Groninger Museum. You can look it up on our website. But it is a very interesting area to explore. There was a good catalogue I read from Marta H. Erdelek, and she pointed out the collecting in Canada of the Hague School. And just recently, I read an article in a Dutch newspaper that there is a National Gallery in Washington, which at this very moment is now collecting Hague School again. As I heard that in Canada, is now the case that the Hague School was sold because it was the painters of the Group of Seven that were not very impressed by the Hague School. It wasn't,
not only not impressed,
which is also an influence. To react against is a very interesting influence. So
I was going to say it was a bête noire for them in terms of the popularity. So the Dutch connection is a very interesting one.
There's a very interesting connection, yes. Well,
thank you. Thank you very much, Maria.
You're welcome.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to make a quick point in that context. We are also not very much aware that our artists were very familiar with Dutch art, and in 1931, J.H. MacDonald actually delivered a very comprehensive lecture at the Art Gallery of Toronto at the time, speaking about Hummershoy and Feistad and all of the artists that were part of that Albright Knox 1913 exhibition. I had a transcript of that lecture when I was working on the essay for this catalog, and I was really impressed of the sense of admiration and also understanding of where the Northern Scandinavian artists came from in terms of tradition. But also, I can't resist pointing out that there's a great surprise for Marietta, especially for you downstairs. We have the original copy of the Scandinavian show catalog from 1913 that belonged to J.H. MacDonald. And so I brought it up on display next to a very early Harris from 1913, a snow scene that is probably very reflective of what he saw when he visited with Harris that show in 1913. And the interesting part is, even though the catalog is closed, it's not open, for me was when I was paging through, is that the comments he made about the color, the composition, and everything was actually towards an artist, Anna Bomberg. Contrary to what a lot of our esteemed scholars have been pointed about influence in Munch or Feistad, he was more fascinated with Anna Bomberg's art at that time during the exhibition.
Thank you for that. I understand that exhibition is going to be reconstructed, the 1912.
It was in the Scandinavia House in New York last year.
Oh, last year. No. Okay. My next question is that this exhibition, is different for the Canadian public in particular, draws on private collections and works that I understand have not been seen in the public eye, and you have juxtaposed some of those or integrated them into the exhibition. How does that experience of these new to our eyes works change our understanding of the work of the group or this exhibition vis-a-vis perhaps, there were many private works in your collection, and there are more, as I understand it, here. So could you speak to that?
Well, I don't know whether it changed anything particularly, but it was always part of the kind of curatorial brief. When I started this process, I mean, it's a long, drawn-out process in some ways, in that it's taken me, 25 years to actually get to this point, but actually the exhibition came together relatively quickly at the end in the last 2 or 3 years. And part of the deal was, I mean, when I was talking to my advisors, and an awful lot of people, including, I might add, Ash Prakash, who played a very important role in advising us all, I think, on putting together this exhibition, we thought, yes, we need the famous works, of course we do, and we were very lucky to get the support of the McMichael and the National Gallery and the AGO, who have all lent incredibly generously. But it was always part of the idea that the difference with the show would be myself, a British eye, helping with the selection, but secondly that we would always have a very strong selection of private collection works that would be less familiar to a Canadian audience, because we wanted the show not just to be a kind of revelation to European audiences, but to have a value for Canadian audiences. And at that time, I think we weren't, by the time we were putting together the catalogue, for instance, the show at the McMichael was not on the cards at that point, and so, thanks to Victoria, it's come back home. But we wanted the catalogue to be valid, and for it to be valid, it had to have some surprises in it, just because the great enemy in Canada for the Group of Seven is familiarity, over-familiarity. With the Group of Seven. I mean, what can anyone tell you all about the Group of Seven? So we wanted to have something unfamiliar, just to make it valuable. But as for whether the unfamiliar work had an impact on how you see the Group of Seven, I think it can only be in the sense that it does pull the rug out from under over-familiarity. Basically, if you see that there is far more, because I think there is a canon. Is there not a canon of Group of Seven paintings? The things that you all as Canadians have grown up with on your schoolroom walls are the very famous ones, usually tinging to sepia by the time you saw them as children. So maybe some of your opinions of a Group of Seven was that they were basically painted in brown, whereas in fact they were an most of art history can be defined as brown and anti-brown, I think. Hague School brown, Group of Seven anti-brown. But it did give you more of a sense of the colour and the range, I think. And I think that's the important thing about the show. It does kind of bring things together that perhaps one hasn't seen together for a long time. You're very aware of the paintings individually in different museums, but bringing them together is very valuable and slightly different. But the new stuff just shows you that there's a lot more out there. Now, they're far broader, far more extraordinary, far more beautiful, even than you knew.
And I think we really enjoyed talking with one another in looking at those sketches about what the choices were. And that pattern and space come through in the sketches as profound aesthetic choices of what they experienced in nature and translating that experience.
And one of the things, sorry Joyce, you're probably, but one of the things that fascinated me, and this may be again something that is different with a British eye, was the sense of process with the Canadian artists, because clearly the business of sketches, the whole idea, the tradition of using small panels of wood, is defined by the need to engage with the Canadian wilderness. You can't pack an easel into a canoe. And, if you're going to be hiking you have to be able to carry things around, and the boxes that Katerina has got out for this show are a very clear indicator of what artists had to do. It had to be quite precise and small if you were going to head out into the wilderness. And so the sketch grows out of necessity. It's a canoe-driven idea. And out of that necessity comes actually the most riveting and astonishing thing to a British eye about the Group of Seven, which is the vividness and speed of those sketches. If Thomson or MacDonald or Varley or any of these great sketchers was producing 3 or 4 things a day, quite possibly, you're sitting there knee-deep in snow or knee-deep in black flies or whatever you're knee-deep in, but it's not comfortable, let's put it that way. With a box on your knee, you want to produce things very fast. And so the spontaneity and speed and freshness of the sketches is what leaps out to a British audience. And this is one of perhaps the difference at Dulwich. At Dulwich, I had a wall 3 high of Tom Thomson's sketches. I had a big event for the Royal Academicians, a great big dinner at the Royal Academicians at Dulwich Picture Gallery, reinventing a 19th century tradition we had there. And I'm just delighted to say that I found a group of Royal Academicians all riveted by Tom Thomson, as they were supposed to be. So our painters were firmly in front of Thomson. They'd never seen anything quite so extraordinary. Now, I'm not sure if that's something that a Canadian audience is quite aware of. I mean, you've become so aware of it. But the comparison between the sketch and the finished work was terribly important to this show. That sense of process, of working out in nature and then going back to your shack. In the case of Tom Thomson, it's just down the road here, just down the path. Going back to a freezing cold shack in Toronto and working them up into finished paintings. It's a rather different relationship between the sketch and the final image, I think, and a very interesting one, very different from the European tradition of sketching.
I'll be the last to mention the bodies, but 6 of them are buried on our grounds. And I know I don't like that, mentioning that, but listening to Ian, I thought, at least Varley's spirit will be very happy, because towards the end of his life he wrote many letters, and I'm familiar with his position on that. He always regretted that he was never really welcomed and appreciated and recognized back home, back in England. So I think that goes back to saying, wow, thank you, Ian.
That's very interesting, because the question that came out of hearing you speak from my perspective was, did you do anything to do the evolution of Varley, from Sheffield and the hills, and rolling to, the mountains of BC, Northern Ontario, but particularly, the mountains of BC, not just Lynn Valley, but the Table Mountain, etc.
Well, actually, no, and I think it may have been a missed opportunity. I mean, there is material in Sheffield, in the Sheffield archives, about, of course, Lismer was there too. Lismer and Varley both trained in Sheffield, but not much that one could make use of. It's actually one of the most interesting things about the pair of them, I think, is that they came over, as did so many, including apparently all of my great uncles and my grandfather, all came over to Canada. About this time, it was a common thing in Britain to come to Canada as a land of opportunity. But Lismer, certainly when he arrived, was painting like a British impressionist. Quite pretty, quite decorative. And as we know, he became this very strong graphic artist, very powerful lines, powerful colors. And it's very interesting. You can see in the photographs that Katerina has put out in the exhibition that there are early photographs of Varley and Lismer joining Tom Thomson in Algonquin. And Tom Thomson was very much the guide. But, my goodness, they've adopted the look, the 2 cats. It's as if once they arrived, they became very Canadian indeed. And I don't think, as far as I'm aware, that Yorkshire is going to prepare you for Algonquin Park.
I think that's something else that the 3 of us talked about a lot, was what the relationship was between the 3 artists. And to imagine that some Lynn Valley works by Varley are actually very like MacDonald works. I mean, we wouldn't have thought that before. So just having the chance to see those artists together and to make those connections was a huge element of our work together.
And this is one for Katerina as well. One of the things about Varley, it seems to me that Varley, some of the artists, you know, it's all quite consistent, and you've got a kind of group of 7 aesthetic, obviously. But Varley always looks unique, and this is partly, I think, because he went out to Vancouver quite early on. But also, he was a highly sophisticated artist, and I think that was his art college training in Sheffield. I mean, Sheffield may seem like the back of beyond now. It's an industrial northern town, but it was actually quite a hotbed of artistic intent at that time. So it was a very good place to learn. And Varley, it intrigues me, for instance, I chose particularly the Vancouver mountain scenes with Katerina's advice. Of course, she's a great expert on Varley. But I particularly chose them, and even at the time, I was thinking to myself, this looks so like Ferdinand Hodler, the Swiss artist. And I can't believe that he hadn't seen Hodler's, whether he'd seen them in person. But then this is the big question about Thomson as well. Where did Thomson come from? And one minute he's painting in greys, and then he's painting in these dazzling colours in a completely different style. And it seems to have emerged out of conversations with Jackson and Harris, presumably. But also, presumably, they were looking at Studio Magazine. And literally, I mean, looking at magazines and being influenced by what was happening in Europe. And it's very
Well, Britain obviously has a huge theatrical tradition, and the crossover between theatre production, stage sets, and artistic practice in Canada was strong with the group. I suppose that division wasn't welcomed by the British critics.
They wouldn't understand it. Again, they wouldn't have the context in which to understand.
But you might also argue that the Brits were quicker to move into abstraction, and Harris was precluded by virtue of the environment in Toronto in particular, but in Canada more generally, from taking his work until he really left Canada in the early 30s. This was as close as he could get in a public forum to moving into abstraction, and those works really are caught between those two. And so, ultimately it's perhaps a different environment in that respect.
Yes, and I mean, it all pans out differently depending on which artist is rising to the top at any given time. In England, you have Nicholson, Ben Nicholson, and Henry Moore, transforming the way art is going. And before that, it had been kind of a realist tradition. Nicholson himself, of course, moves on very nicely from his glorious father, William Nicholson. He's now less famous, but was a wonderful, lush realist painter of still lives. And the transformation from in the 30s with Piper and Nicholson particularly, and Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, into an abstract tradition is quite abrupt and quite modish in its way. It's a very abrupt and kind of advanced transition. Harris, we can see now with hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, is moving towards abstraction in the sense that he's abstractifying his vision of these mountains and icebergs. He's turning them into kind of abstract sculptures.
Do you think that if you had put Harris's work of the Arctic work and some of that theatrical Lake Superior work, if I could call it that, against World War I British painting, they wouldn't have said that, because those war paintings are theatrical?
Yes. And actually, it's a very good point. I mean, there is a tradition. Again, it's kind of surrounding Augustus John, who does loom large in that period, but an artist who you could compare with Harris, I think, is Henry Lamb, much underestimated British artist, glorious painter, who works in a similarly kind of abstracted way, but in a very figurative tradition. And that's the point, I think. Despite the British landscape tradition, the 20th century, I think, is, before abstraction takes over, is quite a figurative place to be.
I have. Okay. The question is whether I ask my last question, or I let you go, Katerina. I'll just tell you what the question was, so you can all think about it, and then I'm going to let you go. I saw War Horse last night, and I have to tell you that the only thing I could think of in the war scenes and in the mud was Varley's war art, and I'm very interested. I mean, one of the questions I would ask the curators is the choice, the narrative that you chose to represent the group. You have the Jacksons, but on the other hand, it's a relatively constricted narrative in terms of the evolution. You can only do so much, but I'd be very interested in hearing how those choices were made from a curatorial perspective.
Okay.
Should I start?
Why not?
Well, I'll let Ian finish the answer to that, but there were some, definitely, Anna and I were a little more patriotic here in saying, oh yes, how about the war art, how about Varley portraits, and so on, and the additional members of the group rather than the original members, so I'll let Ian address that issue. But what I wanted to say earlier in terms of the connection with the British landscape tradition is that we often forget that Varley comes from a very prominent tradition of painters. John Varley was one of the well-respected sort of 19th century British landscape artists. He wrote a manual about painting in watercolors and landscape. So, and you see how Varley deviated from that tradition, how completely changed and different he was, even though very proud of the tradition of his family. And that is something that we also need to look in terms of who else came from Sheffield. There's Elizabeth Nutt, there's a number of Sheffield artists who also came at that same period with Lismer and Varley to Canada. I said something on Thursday night when Ian and I were welcoming our members for the preview, is that the entryway to the exhibition is something new that we're trying. We're actually, my curatorial department claimed other spaces, additional spaces, so we spilled in the lobby, and our entryway to the exhibition now is a prominent, almost Roman emperor kind of a triumph returning home. And I dedicated that entryway to Ian because what we did is we juxtaposed the 1924-25 press reviews that brought the group of 7 members home as heroes after a major recognition in England then. And then on the opposite side, we have 2012 British reviews. So as you go through the spaces during your break, you can muse through and see this kind of a mixture of lukewarm, very negative, but also very positive praises for Thomson. And also we embedded archival photographs within the 1924-25 critical press reviews with the photograph of the installation as well as the photograph of the jury at the time who selected the works. So here's back to our jury here.
Can I perhaps just go back to that idea about what was contained in the show? Anyone who organizes exhibitions must realize it's showmanship. It really is. You have to control it. It's like writing a novel or making a film. Believe me, I know how limited the selection was in one sense. There are none of my favorite Lauren Harris's are probably those wonderful town views, which Bliss, and also the very Scandinavian winter scenes that he did. And I feel all of the artists were quite broad. I mean, obviously Varley is a portraitist. And so when we started, of course, we had doing this transatlantically is quite difficult, as you can imagine. And so there was Dropbox. There's an app for it. We had Dropbox full of all the images, and working down the selection to something that would work. There comes a point where you have to realize you can't do everything. And also that if you don't do anything, then there's a pretty good chance of doing another show later.
On that note, I'm going to say thank you to our panelists. I've learned a lot, and I really want to thank you. And thank you for the exhibition, most of all. Thank you all for coming.
And a thank you to Joyce for asking such pertinent questions. So thank you very much, panelists. And again, I'm going to add my own thanks to the co-curators as well as to Marietta.